By the year 1944, the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean had become a graveyard for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The grand dream of a maritime empire was sinking beneath the waves, vessel by vessel, under the relentless pressure of American industrial might. The carriers were gone, the experienced pilots were fewer by the day, and the horizon was increasingly filled with the gray silhouettes of the United States Fifth Fleet. But as the Japanese leadership realized they could no longer win the war on the surface of the water, they turned to a darker, more desperate strategy. If they could not hold the sea, they would inhabit the earth. They would turn the very islands they occupied into hollowed-out fortresses, creating a subterranean world where the sun never shone and where thousands of men were ordered to live, fight, and die in the damp silence of the rock. To understand the tragedy of the final year of the Pacific War, we must leave the deck of the battleships and descend into the hidden cities of concrete and stone. The strategy was known as the endurance defense. The goal was no longer to stop the Americans at the water's edge. The Japanese High Command knew that American naval gunfire was too powerful to resist on an open beach. Instead, the plan was to draw the Americans inland, into a nightmare of tunnels, caves, and hidden pillboxes. Every island was to be transformed into a stationary aircraft carrier made of volcanic rock. Imagine being a young soldier from a rural village in Japan, suddenly transported to a tiny speck of land in the middle of the ocean. You were handed a pickaxe and a shovel. You were told that the emperor expects you to dig. Day after day, month after month, you carve into the limestone or the volcanic ash. You are not building a home, you are building a tomb. These tunnel networks were masterpieces of desperate engineering. On islands like Peleliu, Biak, and Iwo Jima, the Japanese created multi-level underground complexes. There were barracks, command centers, hospitals, and even small factories, all connected by miles of narrow, claustrophobic passages. Some tunnels were so small that soldiers had to crawl on their hands and knees to move between positions. The environmental conditions inside these hidden cities were horrific. The Pacific is a place of extreme heat and humidity. Deep inside the rock, with no ventilation, the air became thick and stagnant. The smell was a constant assault on the senses, the stench of unwashed bodies, the smell of damp earth, the metallic tang of stored ammunition, and the rot of untreated wounds. Because the Americans controlled the air and the sea, the Japanese soldiers could rarely emerge during the day. To be seen on the surface was to invite a barrage of fire from a destroyer off the coast. This meant that for thousands of soldiers, life became a nocturnal existence. They became like ghosts, moving only in the shadows, their skin turning a sickly, pale gray from the lack of sunlight. Water was perhaps the greatest challenge. While the Pacific is surrounded by water, very little of it is drinkable. In the underground fortresses, every drop was precious. Soldiers would hang blankets or rags against the damp cave walls to soak up condensation, then wring them out into a cup. They lived in a state of constant, agonizing thirst, their tongues swollen, their voices reduced to whispers. But the physical suffering was only half of the story. The psychological toll of living in a hole in the ground while waiting for an inevitable invasion was devastating. In the diaries recovered after the war, we see the transition from soldiers to cave dwellers. One soldier wrote about how he had forgotten what the sky looked like. He wrote that the only way he knew it was morning was by the slight change in the temperature of the rock. Another wrote about the sound of the ocean. From deep inside the cliffside bunkers, the waves did not sound like water. They sounded like the breathing of a giant beast, a constant reminder that they were trapped between the stone and the sea. The isolation was total. The American blockade meant that letters from home rarely arrived. These men were cut off from their families, their country, and their hope. They were told that their lives were a shield for the home islands. They were told that every day they stayed alive in their caves was another day Japan was safe. Then, the invasion would begin. For the American Marines landing on these beaches, the islands often looked deserted. The preliminary bombardments would flatten every tree and every building on the surface. To the observers on the ships, it seemed impossible that anything could survive. But deep beneath the burning sand, the Japanese were waiting. When the Marines moved inland, the ground itself seemed to breathe fire. A hidden slit in a rock, barely visible to the naked eye, would suddenly erupt with machine gun fire. A spider hole in the middle of a trail would open, and a soldier would emerge to throw a grenade before disappearing back into the earth. This was a new kind of war. It was intimate, dark, and terrifying. The Americans had to use flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear the caves one by one. They called it corkscrew and blowtorch tactics. It was a slow, grueling process of sealing men alive in their fortresses. For the Japanese inside, the end often came in a roar of flame or a sudden, deafening collapse of the ceiling. The pressure from the explosions in the confined spaces would burst eardrums and collapse lungs. If the entrance was sealed by a bulldozer, the men inside were left to slowly suffocate in the dark. Despite this, the resistance continued. The bravery of these men was fueled by a mixture of intense nationalism and a complete lack of alternatives. There was no way to retreat. There was no way to surrender without bringing shame upon their families. So, they stayed in the dark, clutching their rifles, waiting for the sound of footsteps above. On the island of Iwo Jima, the tunnel system was so extensive that even after the island was declared secure by the United States, hundreds of Japanese soldiers remained underground. For weeks, they lived like phantoms, emerging at night to scavenge for food and water from American supply dumps. Some remained in the tunnels for months after the war ended, unaware that the world had moved on. When we look at the ruins of these fortifications today, we see more than just concrete and rust. We see the physical manifestation of a nation's refusal to accept defeat. We see the length to which a government will go to sacrifice its youth. In many of these caves, historians have found small, personal items. A broken comb, a small porcelain doll, a canteen with a name scratched into the metal. These objects remind us that these were not just nameless defenders of an empire. They were individuals. They were sons and fathers who spent their final months on Earth in a humid, dark tunnel, listening to the heartbeat of the Pacific. The concrete cities under the islands are silent now. The jungle has grown over the entrances. The salt air has eaten away at the steel reinforcements. In many places, the tunnels have collapsed, burying the secrets of 1945 forever. But for those who walk the beaches of Okinawa or Peleliu, there is a lingering sense of unease. You realize that beneath your feet, there is another world. A world of shadows and sacrifice. A world that was built with the sweat of men who knew they would never see the sunrise again. The story of the Pacific War is often told through the lens of great victories and massive explosions. But the true heart of the war is found in the silence of those caves. It is found in the endurance of the human spirit when faced with the absolute dark. As we look out over the peaceful blue waters of the Pacific today, we must remember the cost of that peace. We must remember the men who lived in the rock, and the men who had to go into the dark to find them. Their story is a testament to the horror